All right, so we're diving deep today into Isaiah 43:2.
Yeah, a verse I'm sure a lot of our listeners are very familiar with.
Oh, absolutely. But familiar doesn't always mean we've squeezed all the juice out of it, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we want to bring you guys, the pastors and Bible study leaders out there, stuff that'll really make your sermons and studies pop.
Exactly.
So we dug into a bunch of commentaries from pastors across a ton of denominations.
Really trying to find those less obvious interpretations.
Yeah. The ones that'll make your congregation go, whoa, I never thought of it that way.
And that's what was so fascinating, right? So many pastors are pushing back on that whole God will magically fix everything. Take on Isaiah 43:2.
Yeah, it's not a get out of jail free card, right?
Not at all. It's not about avoiding the fires, but about his presence in them.
Like Joel Osteen. He had a really funny way of putting it.
Oh, yeah.
He told this story about a guy who converts to Catholicism and starts sprinkling holy water on his steak, like raw steak.
Like it's going to magically cook.
Right. Expecting a miracle.
Which, it is funny, but it highlights the point.
Hmm.
The verse isn't about bypassing hardship.
It's about inviting transformation.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. Recognizing God's presence, even when things are tough.
Now, Osteen uses humor, but another pastor we looked at, Zion, Anywhere, took this whole idea in a more, I don't know, philosophical direction.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They actually suggest that maybe trials are meant to nourish our faith.
Like they make us stronger.
Yeah. Don't pray for the fire to go out, pray for the strength to walk through it, kind of thing.
Exactly. They actually compare it to being served bread at a restaurant.
Okay.
It's not meant to fill you up, right? It's meant to make you even more hungry.
For the main course.
Right, and challenges can do that for our spirit.
Make us crave God's presence more.
Exactly. And this ties in with, this whole concept of even if faith.
Okay, I'm intrigued now. What is even if faith?
Well, another pastor, the Father's House, this is right up their alley, they say it's that faith that says, even if I face hardship, even if things go sideways, I still trust God.
Standing firm no matter what, huh?
Exactly. And they illustrate it with that classic story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Ah, the fiery furnace.
Right. Their faith wasn't about escaping the fire.
It was about trusting God inside it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
Makes you think, though, how is that different from, like, the whole prosperity gospel thing you hear so much these days? They both seem to be about faith when things are tough, but are they really the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it needs some nuance to unpack.
Okay,
On the surface, sure, they might sound similar.
but there's got to be a difference.
Right. The prosperity gospel, a lot of times it focuses on like material blessings, earthly success, as proof of God's favor.
Okay,
Whereas even if faith, it acknowledges that hardship just is part of life.
and you trust God even when those blessings aren't, like, visible, obvious.
Exactly. It's a subtle difference, but it's important,
Yeah, crucial for us pastors to get that right.
especially when we're talking about faith and hardship.
Absolutely. Even if faith, it's rooted in, like, a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty, our place in his plan.
It's not about manipulating God.
It's about surrender, even when it's hard.
Now, while the Father's House focuses on this specific type of faith, another sermon we looked at from First Baptist Church of Lauderdale takes a bit of a different angle.
Okay, tell me more.
They zero in on that potter and play analogy in Isaiah 43:2.
Ah, classic, but always good.
Right, but they take it deeper. They say God doesn't just create us.
He forms us.
Yes, and hardships are part of that shaping, like the potter's wheel.
Instead of just enduring trials, we should see them as, like, opportunities to be refined.
Like we're being molded into something new, something stronger.
I like that.
And this pastor, they brilliantly tie this to Jeremiah 33 and Romans 5.8.
Okay.
It's not just about God's power, but his redemptive work in us.
So it's not why me when things go wrong.
Right.
It's what is God making me into through this?
That's a powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah, big time. Okay, so we've talked about these different approaches to the verse itself, but what about sermon illustrations? Did you find any that were, unique or unexpected?
Oh, tons. One that really stood out was from Generation Church.
Okay.
They connected the burning bush from Exodus, to theophany, like a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus.
Whoa. Okay, I'm following.
So this pastor was saying, we can view this passage in Isaiah through the lens of Christ being with us, even in those fiery trials.
Ooh, I like that. That ties the Old and New Testaments together nicely.
Exactly. It's not just reciting the verse, it's going deeper into what it means theologically.
What else did you find?
Well, that same sermon from Generation Church, they also talked about that whole milk and honey imagery.
Oh, right, the promised land, abundance, all that.
Right, but this pastor pointed out that we shouldn't take it literally.
Okay.
It's a form of what's called typology, where something physical in the Old Testament foreshadows something deeper in the New.
So the milk and honey, they mean more than just, like, food and wealth.
Exactly. They point to the spiritual nourishment we find in Christ.
Wow. Much richer than just the surface meaning.
Right. And it's a perfect example of how pastors can use typology to bring out the deeper truths in the Bible.
It's not just reading, it's understanding the layers of meaning.
Exactly. And that's what makes this duck dive so valuable, right? We're uncovering those hidden gems.
Not just skimming the surface.
And they can enrich our understanding and inspire our teaching.
We've covered a lot here, though.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure we have time to get into some other cool stuff from these sermons.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to explore.
But let's take a second to pause and think. Which of these interpretations spoke to you the most so far? Which one sparked an idea for your next sermon or study?
As we keep going with this, one thing that really stood out to me was how these pastors are using humor in their sermons on Isaiah 43:2.
Yeah, not what you'd think of, right? With a topic like hardship and trials.
But it works surprisingly well.
Humor disarms people, makes them more open to what you're saying.
Like a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
And Austeen's holy water steak story definitely did that. What other examples did you see?
Well, one pastor, he told this funny story about himself misinterpreting God's promises.
Oh,
Yeah, he said he used to think, becoming a Christian, then all his problems would just disappear.
like that holy water on the steak, instant results.
Exactly. But he realized being a believer isn't about avoiding challenges, it's about facing them.
Knowing God's right there with you.
Right. And by sharing that personal story, he connected with his congregation.
Showed he gets it. He's been there.
And that vulnerability, it builds trust, creates a shared experience.
Okay, so humor is one way to make these deep truths more, accessible.
Yeah.
What else did these pastors use?
A lot of them use pop culture references, actually. Remember how the Father's House brought up Destiny's Child and WWF wrestling?
Oh, yeah. Totally unexpected.
Yeah.
How did they even tie that in?
Well, they were talking about how in our culture we're bombarded with messages all the time.
Telling us what to think, how to act, what to buy, yeah.
Yeah. It's like a constant noise drowning everything else out.
Easy to get swept away.
And that's where the wrestling came in. They said it's like the WWF, loud, over the top, all those crazy characters.
So those cultural messages, they're just as loud and distracting as like a wrestling match.
Exactly, making it hard to hear God's voice. And then they contrasted that with Destiny's Child.
More harmonious, subtle.
Representing God's still, small voice.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, but it's one thing to point out the problem, right?
Yeah.
How do we actually, turn down the volume?
Well, this pastor, he gave some practical advice. He talked about being intentional about what we consume, both media and relationships.
Being mindful of the voices we let influence us.
Right. And it's not just external stuff. He also said we got to silence that inner critic.
Oh, man, the negative self-talk.
Can be just as loud as anything out there.
So true. But we have the power to choose what we listen to.
Right. We can choose to focus on God's promises, drown out the noise. Now, speaking of choosing, let's go back to that potter and clay thing for a minute. It's powerful, but it raises some questions, Like, if God's the potter molding us through trials, do we even have a choice?
Tough question, right? Theologians have been debating that forever. But this pastor, he had a nuanced take on it.
Okay.
He said God doesn't force us into trials.
Right.
We make choices. But he uses those choices, even the bad ones, to shape us.
So it's not about God causing suffering. It's about him using it for good.
Yeah. It's recognizing that even in the dark times, he's working to redeem us, restore us. It's not always comfortable, but it's necessary.
This makes me think of another sermon we looked at, one that really focused on the transformative power of trials.
You're talking about the one that compared trials to refining gold.
Yes. They said gold is purified by intense heat, right?
Yeah.
It burns away the impurities.
Leaving behind something stronger, more valuable.
And just like that, they said trials can purify our faith.
Burning away doubts and fears, making our belief deeper, more resilient.
And this church, they were in a community that had been through a lot, so it really resonated.
Offered hope that even in suffering, something beautiful can come out of it.
This pastor even went a step further, bringing up kintsugi,
Oh, I love that.
the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold.
It's so visually powerful, right?
And it illustrates the point perfectly. God doesn't just fix our brokenness. He makes us more beautiful because of it.
Our scars become a testament to his grace.
A message that speaks to anyone who's ever felt broken by life.
It's a reminder that our brokenness doesn't disqualify us from God's love.
It makes us more worthy of it.
All right, so we've got humor, pop culture, personal stories, powerful analogies. What other creative approaches did you see?
Well, a lot of these pastors used music,
Oh, yeah.
incorporating worship songs about God's presence, faithfulness during trials,
Music is so powerful, it goes straight to the heart.
bypasses the head completely.
And some pastors even used secular music to make their points.
Interesting. How so?
One played a clip of a song, I think it was about resilience, overcoming adversity.
To show that even people outside the church, they understand the importance of facing challenges head on.
Exactly. Bridging that gap between sacred and secular.
I like that.
Yeah.
You know, something else that impressed me was how these pastors used stories from their own congregations.
Yeah, these weren't just abstract ideas, they were grounded in real experiences.
People who had walked through fire and came out stronger.
It's one thing to hear a pastor talk about God's faithfulness. It's another to hear it from someone who's lived it.
So powerful. Those personal testimonies, they show that God is real. He's working in people's lives.
And it's not just about victory and triumph. These pastors also acknowledge the pain, the struggle,
They didn't shy away from the tough stuff.
allowed space for doubt, for lament, because faith isn't always easy.
And that authenticity, it makes people feel seen, understood.
Creates a safe space for healing and growth.
We don't have to have it all figured out. We can come to God as we are.
Brokenness and all. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground here. Humor, pop culture, stories, analogies, music, authenticity. But there's one more thing I want to make sure we get to.
What's that?
The way these pastors tied Isaiah 43:2 to the whole story of the Bible.
Ah, yes, the bigger picture.
It's not just an isolated verse, right? It's part of something much grander.
And these pastors did a great job of weaving it into God's plan for humanity.
They showed how it points forward to our ultimate victory in Christ.
But I think we should save that discussion for the last part of our deep dive. We'll be right back after a short. And we're back, ready to finish up this deep dive into Isaiah 43:2. We've explored a lot of interpretations, sermon illustrations, but what I really want to dig into is how these pastors connected this verse to, like, the whole story of the Bible.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, right? Because Isaiah 43:2, it's not just some standalone promise, it's woven into God's whole redemptive plan.
So how did these pastors bring that out, the bigger picture?
Well, one common approach was to tie it back to the Exodus story. Drawing parallels between the Israelites crossing the Red Sea and us going through our own trials.
Ah, classic, but still so powerful.
Right. That image of God parting the waters, rescuing his people, it's timeless.
And by making that connection, these pastors are saying, look, God's faithfulness, it's not limited to one event.
Exactly. He's still making a way for us today, just like he did back then.
Did any of the pastors go beyond that, though? Like beyond the Exodus connection?
Oh, yeah. Several of them linked Isaiah 43:2 to baptism in the New Testament.
Interesting.
They talked about how baptism symbolizes our death to sin and then our resurrection to new life in Christ.
So, like, we pass through the waters of baptism, and we also pass through trials, and we come out transformed on the other side.
Exactly. They were saying that trials, like baptism, can be a cleansing experience, stripping away the old, making way for the new.
It's not punishment, it's growth, renewal.
And it ties the whole thing back to the core of the gospel. Through Christ, we're made new.
Did any of them connect this verse to the end times?
Oh, for sure. Several of the sermons, they drew parallels between the imagery of fire in Isaiah 43:2 and, those biblical descriptions of judgment and purification in the end times.
Okay, that gets a little heavy theologically. How do they handle that?
Well, they were careful to say that God's judgment, it's ultimately for our good. It's not about punishment. It's about making us ready for eternity.
So even in those final moments, God's there with us.
Protecting us, purifying us.
And they tied that back to Isaiah 43 too. Right.
Exactly, saying that just like God promises to be with us in the flames in this life, he'll be with us in the next.
That's comforting, especially for people who are, anxious about the end times.
It's a reminder that his love, his faithfulness, it goes beyond this world.
He's with us always. So we've seen how Isaiah 43:2 can be connected to the Exodus, baptism, even the end times. Any other unexpected connections?
One pastor made a really interesting link to the wilderness, like when the Israelites wandered for 40 years.
Facing trials, hardships, but ultimately becoming like the people God intended them to be.
He used the wilderness as a metaphor for those times in our lives when we're tested, prepared.
It can be scary, disorienting, but it's also a time for incredible growth.
It's like we're forced to confront our idols, our fears, and really learn to depend on God.
And just like the Israelites finally made it to the Promised Land, we can come out of our trials stronger, ready for what God has next.
It's a powerful message of hope. Trials aren't the end, they're often the beginning of something amazing.
So let's wrap this whole thing up for our listeners. What are the big takeaways here? What can they apply to their own ministries?
Well, first, I think it's about recognizing the depth of this verse. It's not just a feel-good promise about avoiding hardship. It's about God's presence with us in the midst of it all.
And it's about getting creative, being intentional about how we teach this. Right? We saw these pastors use humor, pop culture, analogies, stories to bring it to life.
And finally, I think it's about empowering our congregations to see trials differently. Not as defeats, but as chances to grow, to be transformed, to get closer to God.
This has been such a rich conversation, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what Isaiah 43:2 has to offer.
There's always more to discover.
Always. So we'll leave you with this. How can you, as a pastor or Bible study leader, help your people see trials not as detours, but as part of the path that brings them closer to God?
That's something to think about. And may your own journey through these different interpretations inspire you to preach and teach with even more depth, creativity, and compassion.